In the frozen mist of a Scottish coastal mortuary, a man listens to a hum that shouldn't be there. Dr. Alistair Vance thought he understood death. The basement refrigeration unit sang a low, metallic hymn. At 3 a.m. the song changed. It became an echo that answered back. Across the Atlantic, in a crumbling rust-belt morgue, pathologist assistant Clara Castillo watches the fluorescent lights die. The shadows in Gary, Indiana have learned to pulse. Something is moving inside the drained bodies, a crimson fluid that defies all logic, pooling into shapes that hunger. Far north in the snow-buried wilderness of British Columbia, mortuary technician Liam Bouchard feels the glass windows breathe. The dead outside press against the cold. A frozen pulse beats beneath the ice, and the clinic walls are no longer a barrier. 3 places where the veil has worn thin. 3 stories of what waits in the silence after the heart stops. You are about to step inside the coldest rooms on Earth. Story 1: The Unclaimed Echo. The city of Dundee sits on the north bank of the Firth of Tay like a frozen sentinel. In late January, the sea mist rolls in so thick it swallows street lamps whole. The old Victorian buildings turn to smudges of charcoal against a grey sky. Dr. Alistair Vance walked those streets at 2 a.m. with his collar pulled high, his footsteps the only sound on the slick cobblestones. He was a man who had made peace with silence. In his line of work, silence was the default state. He was the senior pathology technician at King's Cross Hospital, which meant he spent more time with the dead than the living. He preferred it that way. The dead never lied, they never made small talk. They simply rested until you opened them up and let the truth spill out. The hospital morgue was in a separate building from the main wards. A squat brick annex built in 1897 with walls thick enough to stop a cannonball. To reach the basement mortuary, you had to take a service elevator that creaked like a ship at sea, then follow a corridor lined with white tile that had yellowed to the color of old teeth. The air down there carried a permanent chill that had nothing to do with the cooling units. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and stayed there. Alistair had worked this shift for 11 years. He knew every hum, every drip, every sigh the old building made. That's why the night of February 3rd stands out in his memory with such brutal clarity, because the sounds he knew by heart suddenly learned to speak. The basement mortuary held 12 refrigeration units built into the far wall. Each one was a stainless steel door set into the brick like a horizontal vault. The compressor motor sat in a separate room behind them, connected by a series of copper pipes that ran along the ceiling. When the system was running normally, it produced a steady low-frequency drone, a metallic hymn that vibrated just at the edge of hearing. Alistair found it soothing. He would sit at his steel desk cataloging tissue samples while that hum wrapped around him like a blanket. On that February night, the mortuary was near capacity. 8 bodies lay in their drawers waiting for morning autopsies. 2 were John Does from a fishing trawler accident. 1 was an elderly woman who had died alone in her flat and wasn't found for 3 weeks. The others were routine cases. Alistair had tagged them all, logged them all, closed their drawers with the gentle push of a man who respected the weight of what he handled. The trouble began at exactly 3 a.m. Alistair knew the time because the wall clock above the sink made a loud click when the minute hand snapped forward. That click cut through the hum and made him glance up from his paperwork. He blinked. The hum had changed. The steady drone he had known for over a decade was no longer steady. It was pulsing, rising and falling in a slow rhythm like the breathing of some enormous creature sleeping behind the brick. He pushed his chair back and walked toward the refrigeration wall. The stainless steel doors looked the same as always. He pressed his palm flat against the metal of drawer number 4. It was cold, colder than it should be. He could feel the vibration through his hand now, a rhythmic thump that didn't match the compressor's normal cycle. He walked around to the machine room and checked the gauges. Everything read normal, pressure steady, temperature steady, yet the sound continued. He returned to his desk and tried to focus on the tissue report in front of him. The words blurred. The pulsing hum was no longer just a background noise. It was insistent. It was demanding his attention, and then it changed again. The rhythm broke, the hum stuttered, and in the split second of silence between pulses, Alistair heard something that made his blood freeze. A voice. A whisper. It came from inside the humming itself, as if the sound waves were shaping themselves into speech. He could not make out words, but he knew with every instinct honed by years in this basement that someone was trying to speak. He stood up so fast his chair spun and hit the tile wall. The basement was empty, except for him and the 8 silent residents behind their steel doors, yet the whisper persisted. It slipped through the hum like a thread of smoke through a keyhole. Alistair forced himself to walk toward the sound. The whisper grew louder near drawer number 7. The elderly woman, the one who had been alone for 3 weeks before anyone noticed she was gone. Her name was Margaret Eames, 83 years old, no next of kin listed. An unclaimed soul waiting for a pauper's burial. Alistair had felt a pang of sadness when he logged her into the system. Now that sadness curdled into dread, he placed his ear against the cold steel of drawer 7. The hum vibrated through his skull, and beneath it he heard the whisper with terrifying clarity. It was not a single voice, it was many. A layered chorus of whispers all speaking at once, and yet somehow forming a single coherent phrase. Alistair, come closer. The words were not spoken in his ear, they bloomed inside his head like an echo that had been waiting decades to find a receiver. He stumbled backward and caught himself on the autopsy table. The stainless steel surface reflected the overhead fluorescent lights in harsh white lines. His reflection stared back at him, wild-eyed and pale. He was a rational man. He believed in science, in the measurable and the provable. What he had just experienced was neither. He pressed his knuckles against his forehead and took 3 slow breaths. Auditory hallucination. That was the obvious explanation. Long hours combined with sleep deprivation and the constant low-frequency vibration could trigger such things. He had read papers on it. He knew the mechanisms. He clung to that knowledge like a life raft, yet his hands were shaking. He looked at drawer 7 again. The stainless steel seemed to shimmer. Just a trick of the light, he told himself. But the whisper had not stopped. It was still there, threading through the hum, and now he could make out more words, not just his name. Other words, fragments of sentences that felt like radio signals from some dark frequency. He did the only thing that made sense in that moment. He decided to open the drawer. He had to see the source. If he could look at the body of Margaret Eames and confirm it was exactly as he had left it, then his rational mind could reassert control. He walked to the drawer and gripped the cold handle, the metal bit into his palm. He pulled. The drawer slid out on its rollers with the soft hiss of escaping cold air. The body lay exactly where it should be. A small, frail form wrapped in a white plastic shroud. Alistair forced himself to fold back the shroud from her face. Margaret Eames looked peaceful. Her eyes were closed. Her skin was pale and waxen. She was dead. She had been dead for weeks. Nothing about her had changed. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. See, he muttered to himself, nothing. And then her lips moved. A sound escaped Alistair that was not a scream, but something more primal. A choked gasp that tore at his throat. He fell back against the opposite wall and watched in absolute horror as the dead woman's mouth formed silent words. Her eyes remained closed. Her body remained still, but her lips kept moving, shaping syllables that matched the whispers still swirling inside his skull. The cold in the room intensified until his breath fogged in front of his face. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then they went out entirely, plunging the basement into absolute darkness. The hum of the refrigeration unit stopped. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing Alistair had ever felt. It pressed against his eardrums. It pushed against his chest. It smothered every rational thought he tried to form. In that darkness he heard her clearly for the first time. Not the whisper of many voices, but one voice. An old woman's voice, trembling and desperate and utterly lost. I am still here. I have been here for so long. Please, don't close the door again. The words were not angry. They were not threatening. They were filled with such profound loneliness that Alistair felt tears sting his eyes even as terror gripped his spine. He could not move. He could not speak. The voice continued. It told him about the 3 weeks in the flat, about the darkness that never ended, about the silence that was so complete she had forgotten the sound of her own name. It told him that the hum had been the first thing she had felt in what seemed like forever. The vibration had given her something to cling to. And when Alistair had pressed his ear to the steel, she had finally been able to reach back. The fluorescent lights flickered back on with a buzz that made Alistair flinch. The hum of the refrigeration units resumed its steady drone. Margaret Eames' lips were still. Her face was once again the peaceful mask of death. But Alistair was not the same man who had walked into this basement. He stood on trembling legs and forced himself to walk back to the open drawer. He looked at her face, really looked, and he saw what he had missed before. A faint discoloration at the corner of her mouth, a residue that glistened under the harsh light. He leaned closer. It was salt, the dried tracks of tears that had no business being on a corpse 3 weeks dead. He closed the drawer with a gentleness he had never used before. Then he sat at his steel desk and stared at the wall until his shift ended. He did not speak of what happened. He told no one. The next morning he made a quiet inquiry. Margaret Eames had no family, no one to claim her remains, no one to attend her burial. Alistair made arrangements at his own expense. He bought a small plot in a cemetery overlooking the Firth of Tay, where the sea mist could roll in and kiss the grass. He attended the burial alone. As the plain coffin was lowered into the cold earth, he felt the hum once more. Just for a moment. A brief vibration that rose from the ground and passed through his shoes into his bones, and in that hum he heard a final whisper, no words this time, just a feeling, a release. A door finally closing from the other side. Alistair still works in that basement mortuary. The hum of the refrigeration units never troubled him again, but every time a new unclaimed body arrives, he speaks to it. He tells it where it is. He tells it the date and the weather. He reads the names from the newspaper. And sometimes when the night is very still, he will place his palm against the cold steel door and wait, just in case someone needs to echo back, because he learned something that night in the freezing dark. The dead are not always silent. They are just waiting for someone to listen. Story 2, The Crimson Fluid. Gary, Indiana wears its ghosts like a second skin. The steel mills that once roared with fire now sit silent and skeletal against a perpetually gray sky. Rust eats through the bones of abandoned factories while the wind carries the faint chemical tang of decades-old industry. At night, the streets empty, the streetlights flicker and sometimes fail entirely, leaving whole blocks swallowed by a darkness so thick it feels solid. It was in the heart of this decay that the Lake County Auxiliary Morgue operated out of a squat concrete building that had no business still standing. The walls were cracked, the roof leaked whenever it rained. The fluorescent tubes in the ceiling buzzed with the tired frequency of bulbs long past their replacement date. Pathologist assistant Clara Castillo worked the graveyard shift alone because budget cuts had eliminated the night security position 3 years ago, and nobody had bothered to fill it. Clara was 26 years old with steady hands and a pragmatic mind. She had grown up in a trailer park outside of town, and nothing in her life had ever come easy. Working with the dead felt natural to her because the dead never judged. They never demanded. They just lay on cold steel tables and waited for someone to speak for them. She saw her job as a form of advocacy. Every body that came through those doors was a story that needed telling. She was the one who prepared them for autopsy. She weighed organs. She collected fluid samples. She drained the chest cavities of the purge fluids that accumulated after death and stored them in labeled containers for toxicology. The work was grim but necessary. And on that sweltering August night, she was the only living soul within a mile radius of the building. The morgue occupied the basement level of the concrete structure. Above it sat a derelict health clinic that had closed in 2018. The windows were boarded. The elevator had been out of service for months. Clara descended the concrete stairwell each night with a flashlight in one hand and her keys in the other. The walls were streaked with dark stains that she preferred not to examine too closely. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy steel door separated the basement from the rest of the building. She unlocked it, pushed through, and was immediately assaulted by the familiar smell. Formaldehyde, decay. The faint metallic note of old blood. The fluorescent tubes overhead flickered to life one by one with a series of reluctant clicks. They cast a sickly yellow light that turned everything the color of old bruises. Clara had long since stopped noticing how the shadows in the corners seemed to writhe when the lights first came on. She chalked it up to tired eyes. Everyone who worked the night shift had tired eyes. The morgue had 3 rooms. The main autopsy suite held 2 steel tables with drainage channels that fed into a central collection basin. A wall of refrigeration units identical to the ones in Dundee hummed their eternal drone. The second room was a cramped office with a metal desk and a computer that still ran Windows XP. The third room was the fluid storage closet, where sealed containers of purge fluid waited for weekly pickup. Clara's task that night was straightforward. The morning crew had performed an autopsy on a John Doe pulled from the Little Calumet River. He was a white male, maybe 50 years old, with no identification and no one looking for him. His body had been in the water for at least 4 days before a fisherman spotted it, tangled in a shopping cart. The autopsy was complete. The organs had been sectioned and sent to the lab. What remained was the fluid. 3 liters of it drained from the chest cavity and collected in a clear plastic container sealed with a red cap. Clara needed to log it, label it, and transfer it to the storage closet. She pulled the container from the refrigeration unit and set it on the counter beside the sink. The fluid inside was a deep, unsettling crimson. It looked thicker than normal, more viscous. She tilted the container and watched the liquid slosh against the plastic walls in slow motion. She had seen thousands of fluid samples in her career. This one felt wrong in a way she could not immediately articulate. Maybe it was the color. Post-mortem purge fluid was typically a murky brownish red diluted by the water that flooded the lungs. This sample was bright, almost luminous. It caught the flickering light from the overhead tubes and seemed to glow from within. She unscrewed the cap and sniffed. The smell hit her like a physical blow. It was not the coppery salt tang of blood, nor the sickly sweet note of decay. It was something else entirely, a smell she had never encountered in any morgue. It smelled like ozone and hot copper, and underneath it all a faint floral sweetness like wild roses blooming in a graveyard. She recoiled and screwed the cap back on quickly. Her pulse had quickened. She told herself it was just an unusual decomposition pattern. The river water might have introduced some chemical contaminant. There was a rational explanation for everything. That's what she believed. She logged the sample into the computer with stiff fingers. John Doe 8-15-2026. Fluid collection complete. Transfer to storage pending. The keyboard was sticky with the accumulated residue of countless hands. The screen flickered in sympathy with the lights overhead. Clara rubbed her eyes and stood up to carry the container to the storage closet. That's when the lights died. The fluorescent tubes did not flicker a warning. They simply went black all at once, plunging the autopsy suite into absolute darkness. Clara froze. The hum of the refrigeration units continued, which meant the power was not entirely out, just the lights. She fumbled for the flashlight in her pocket and clicked it on. The narrow beam cut through the darkness and landed on the counter where the fluid container sat. What she saw made her breath catch. The container was glowing, faintly. A soft red luminescence pulsed from within the plastic like a heartbeat. She took a step closer. Then another. The glow intensified with each beat, casting strange shadows that danced on the walls. She should have run. Every instinct screaming in her skull told her to drop the flashlight and bolt for the stairwell, but Clara was a scientist. She was trained to observe, to analyze, to find the rational explanation even when the evidence pointed toward something impossible. So she did not run. She leaned in. The crimson fluid inside the container was moving, not sloshing from the motion of her steps, but moving on its own. It swirled slowly at first, like a whirlpool forming in a glass, then faster. The surface of the liquid rose into a tendril that pressed against the plastic lid. The lid bulged upward. The seal strained. Clara stumbled backward and her hip collided with the autopsy table. The impact sent a jolt of pain through her body, but she barely felt it. The lid of the container popped off with a wet suction sound and clattered to the floor. The crimson fluid flowed out. It did not splash. It did not spread like normal liquid. It pooled together in a single coherent mass that seemed to ignore gravity. It slithered up the side of the container and onto the counter in a thick rope of glistening red. Clara's flashlight beam trembled. The fluid mass was the size of a fist now. It pulsed with that same slow heartbeat rhythm. And then it began to shape itself. The rope of liquid thickened and condensed. It formed a rough sphere that elongated. Limbs sprouted. A torso, a head. It was building itself a body. A tiny humanoid figure made entirely of shimmering crimson fluid. No taller than 6 inches, it stood on the counter like a grotesque little doll, and its head turned toward Clara. She could not see eyes. There were no features on its face, but she knew with a certainty that bypassed rational thought that it was looking at her, and it was hungry. She did not scream. Her throat had closed completely. The little figure took a step forward on legs that dripped and reformed with each movement. It left no wet footprints. The counter remained dry beneath it. The fluid that composed its body was not bound by the rules of physics. It was something else entirely, something that had been dormant in the body of a drowned man until the autopsy released it into the open air. Clara's flashlight flickered, the beam stuttered and dimmed, and she realized with cold horror that the batteries were draining, not dying naturally, but being drained. The same way the fluorescent lights had died, the creature was pulling energy from its surroundings, feeding on it. The shadows in the room began to pulse. That was the only word for it. The darkness in the corners swelled and contracted in rhythm with the creature's heartbeat glow. The shadows were alive. They had always been alive. They had just been waiting for something to give them form. Clara backed toward the office door. Her hand found the wall and slid along the cold concrete, searching for the doorframe. The creature on the counter watched her retreat. It tilted its head like a curious child. Then it raised one tiny hand, and the shadows answered. A wave of darkness rolled across the floor like spilled oil. It reached the autopsy table, and the table groaned. The steel warped. The metal legs twisted inward as if crushed by an invisible fist. Clara found the door frame and threw herself into the office. She slammed the door shut behind her and pressed her back against it. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her flashlight was dead. The only light came from the computer screen, casting the cramped office in a pale blue glow. She did not have much time. She knew that. She could hear wet sounds from the autopsy suite, slithering, sloshing. The creature was growing. It had absorbed energy from the lights and the shadows, and now it was absorbing mass from whatever it could find. The other fluid containers in the storage closet, the residual blood in the drainage basin. It was building itself larger. Clara's mind raced. The rational part of her brain was still trying to categorize this experience, a hallucination brought on by chemical exposure, a prion disease that caused visual disturbances, a gas leak. Anything but the truth. The truth was that something had been sleeping inside the dead, something that had been there all along in every body she had ever drained. She had just never seen it wake before. The door behind her shuddered. The wood buckled inward. She felt the pressure of something heavy pressing against the other side. She scrambled away from the door and pressed herself into the corner by the desk. The computer screen flickered. The Windows XP logo warped into a smear of static. The temperature in the room dropped sharply. Her breath fogged in front of her face. The door cracked down the middle. A thick rope of crimson fluid oozed through the split. It probed the air like a blind snake tasting the atmosphere. It found her scent. It surged forward. Clara did the only thing left. She grabbed the metal desk chair and swung it at the door with every ounce of strength she possessed. The chair connected with the wood and the wood shattered, but the creature did not. The fluid simply parted around the impact and reformed. It was not solid enough to hit. It was liquid and shadow and hunger given shape. It flowed into the office and rose up to the height of a man. Its form was humanoid now, broad-shouldered, long-limbed, its head nearly touched the ceiling. It had no face, but Clara could feel its attention on her like a physical weight. It was looking at her the way a predator looks at wounded prey. She thought about the drowned man, the John Doe. He had been alone in the river for 4 days. No one had claimed him. No one had mourned him. The loneliness of that death was an ache she could feel in her own chest, and she understood then what this creature was. It was not the man. It was everything the man had carried in his final moments: the fear, the despair, the terrible solitude of sinking into dark water with no one to reach for. Those emotions had fermented in the dark of the river. They had curdled into something dense and sentient, and when the autopsy drained his chest, the emotions drained out too. They took the physical form of the fluid. They took the crimson color of his last living thoughts, and now they wanted to share that loneliness. They wanted to pull her into it. The creature reached for her, its arm elongated across the room. Clara closed her eyes. She did not pray. She had never been religious. Instead, she did something that surprised her. She spoke. She told the creature that she saw it. She acknowledged the loneliness. She said the words that no one had ever said to the man in the river. "You are not forgotten. You are seen. You are not alone anymore." The words felt foolish and small, but she meant them. She poured every ounce of sincerity she had into those simple phrases. The creature stopped. Its extended arm hung in the air inches from her face. The surface of the fluid rippled, the deep crimson color flickered. For a moment, Clara saw something inside the mass, a face, not the drowned man's face, but something older, something that had been lonely for much longer than 4 days. It was the accumulated loneliness of every unclaimed body that had ever passed through this morgue. Every nameless soul that had been drained and catalogued and stored on a shelf. They were all there swimming in the crimson fluid, and for just 1 second they were listening. Then the creature collapsed. It fell into a shapeless pool on the floor. The fluid spread across the tile, and this time it did not move. It was just liquid again, dark and still and ordinary. The fluorescent lights in the autopsy suite buzzed back to life. The shadows shrank back into the corners. The computer screen flickered and restored its normal display. Clara stood in the corner of the office with her heart pounding and tears streaming down her face. She did not move for a long time. When she finally found the courage to step over the pool and walk back into the autopsy suite, she saw that the fluid container on the counter was empty and clean. No trace of the crimson substance remained, not a drop. She called her supervisor at dawn and quit over the phone. She never set foot in that building again, but she thinks about it often, about the loneliness that had been alive and hungry, about the way the shadows pulsed with a heartbeat of their own, and she wonders if other morgues have the same problem, if other pathologist assistants are watching their fluorescent lights die right now while something crimson begins to stir. She hopes someone speaks to them before it's too late. Story 3. The Frozen Pulse. Prince George sits at the confluence of 2 rivers in the heart of British Columbia, but in late January the rivers vanish. They freeze solid beneath layers of snow so deep that the city becomes an island in a white ocean. The logging trucks stop running, the roads close, the temperature drops to 40 below and stays there for weeks. Liam Bouchard was used to it. He had been born in this cold, raised in a cabin 50 miles north where the only heat came from a wood stove and the only light in winter was the brief grey twilight between 10 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. He had seen cold kill men before. Hypothermia turned them confused first, then sleepy, then dead. The bodies would curl into themselves like sleeping children. That was the cold's one mercy. It made death look peaceful. But what Liam saw on the night of January 17th was not peaceful. It was the opposite of peace. It was something that should have stayed frozen and forgotten. The Prince George Regional Medical Clinic served the entire northern interior. Its morgue was a small addition, built onto the back of the main building, separated from the wards by a short corridor with a door that locked from both sides. The room held 4 refrigeration drawers and a single autopsy station. Liam worked the night shift as the mortuary technician because no one else wanted the job. The pay was decent. The work was quiet. He spent his nights cataloging tissue samples and preparing bodies for transport to the larger hospital in Vancouver. Most of the dead were old loggers with lungs full of sawdust or indigenous elders who had lived long enough to see the world change beyond recognition. Liam treated them all with the same quiet reverence. He spoke to them while he worked, telling them the hockey scores or describing the weather outside. It was a habit he had picked up from his grandmother, who believed the dead needed to hear the voices of the living for a little while longer before they moved on. That night, the blizzard had been raging for 3 days straight. The snow drifts rose higher than the ground floor windows. The wind howled through the ventilation shafts with a sound like a wounded animal. Liam had trudged through the storm from his apartment at 6 in the evening and arrived at the clinic covered in white. He shook the snow from his parka and stamped his boots on the mat. The main clinic was empty. The day staff had been sent home early. The only other person in the building was a night nurse named Evelyn who worked the palliative care ward on the second floor. She was a solid woman in her 50s who had seen every horror the human body could produce and still found time to bake cookies for the staff. She waved at Liam from the nurse's station and he waved back. They would not see each other again until morning. That was how these nights worked. Each of them alone in their own corner of the building, keeping watch over the living and the dead. Liam pushed through the corridor door and entered the morgue. The fluorescent lights flickered on. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the clinic because the heating vents had been sealed off years ago to keep the bodies preserved. His breath fogged in the air. He checked the logbook on the metal desk, 3 bodies in the drawers. 2 were scheduled for transport south when the roads cleared. The 3rd was a new arrival that had come in just before the storm hit. A logger named Daniel Croft, 42 years old, found frozen solid in the bush near Bear Lake. He had been missing for 2 weeks before a search party stumbled across his body in a snow-filled ravine. Liam read the intake notes with a frown. The body had been frozen stiff when they found him, not just surface frozen, but frozen through to the core. The coroner had ruled it accidental death by exposure, case closed. But there was a note at the bottom of the report in the coroner's cramped handwriting that made Liam pause. Unusual crystalline formations observed in the thoracic cavity recommend further analysis. No further analysis had been done because the storm had shut everything down. The body had been shoved into drawer number 3 and left for Liam to deal with. He pulled open the drawer. The body inside was wrapped in a standard white shroud. Liam folded back the fabric and took a long look at Daniel Croft. The logger was a big man with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they could crush stone. His skin was pale blue, almost translucent in the harsh fluorescent light. Frost still clung to his eyelashes and the stubble on his chin. He had not thawed, not even slightly. The morgue was cold, but not cold enough to maintain a deep freeze. By all logic, the body should have begun to soften by now. But Daniel Croft was as solid as granite. Liam pressed a gloved finger against the man's forearm. It was like pressing against frozen steel. The cold radiated through his glove and bit into his skin. He pulled his hand back quickly. Something was very wrong. He wheeled the portable examination lamp closer and bent over the body. That's when he saw the crystals. They were barely visible at first, just a faint shimmer beneath the skin of the chest. He adjusted the lamp and the light caught them. They sparkled with a cold blue fire. Tiny crystalline structures arranged in patterns that looked almost deliberate. They were clustered around the sternum, radiating outward in concentric rings like ripples on a frozen pond. Liam grabbed a magnifying lens from the instrument tray and leaned in closer. The crystals were not random. They formed a shape, a spiral, an ancient symbol that tickled something in the back of his memory. He had seen that spiral before. His grandmother had carved it into the doorframe of their cabin to keep the cold spirits out. She had told him stories about the Wendigo, the hunger spirit that stalked the frozen forests and possessed those who resorted to cannibalism to survive. But the spiral was older than the Wendigo. It was a symbol of something deeper, something that had been in these woods long before humans ever set foot on the continent. He straightened up and stepped back from the drawer. The fluorescent lights flickered. The wind outside the building rose to a shriek that rattled the glass window set high in the morgue wall. That window was the only connection to the outside world. It was a small rectangle of reinforced glass that looked out onto the snow-buried parking lot and the black wall of pine forest beyond. Normally Liam ignored it tonight. He found himself glancing at it constantly. The darkness outside felt heavier than usual. It felt like it was pressing against the glass, watching, waiting. He decided to run a standard tissue sample. Something to occupy his hands and quiet his mind. He wheeled the instrument tray over and selected a biopsy needle. The needle was designed to penetrate frozen tissue. He positioned it over the spiral pattern on Daniel Croft's chest and pressed down. The needle met resistance, then slipped through with a sound like cracking ice. Liam extracted a small core of tissue and placed it on a glass slide. Under the microscope, the cells should have been shattered by ice crystals, rendered unrecognizable by the freezing process. Instead, they were intact, perfectly preserved. And they were pulsing. A slow, rhythmic contraction that looked exactly like a heartbeat. Liam pulled back from the microscope so fast he nearly knocked it off the desk. His heart hammered against his ribs. He told himself it was impossible. The man had been dead for 2 weeks. Frozen solid, there was no blood flow, no metabolic activity, no electrical impulses in the tissue. Yet the cells on the slide continued to pulse with that slow, steady rhythm. The fluorescent lights died, all of them. The morgue plunged into absolute darkness. Liam stood frozen in place, one hand still gripping the edge of the desk. The wind outside had stopped. The silence was complete. Then he heard it. A sound that did not belong in any morgue. A heartbeat. Low and deep and resonant. It did not come from the body in the drawer. It came from outside, from beneath the snow, from the frozen earth itself. It was a pulse that traveled up through the concrete floor and into the soles of his boots. He could feel it in his bones. It was the same rhythm as the cells under the microscope. He fumbled for his flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on the high window. What he saw made his mind stutter. The glass was covered in frost, but the frost was on the inside. It had formed in the shape of a hand, a human hand pressed flat against the glass from within the morgue. Liam spun around, sweeping the flashlight beam across the room. There was no one there, just the 3 closed refrigeration drawers and the silent shape of Daniel Croft on the examination table. He turned back to the window. There were more handprints now, dozens of them. They covered the glass in overlapping layers, all pressing inward as if something was trying to push through. But the handprints were not appearing one by one. They were all there already. They had been there the whole time. He just hadn't been able to see them in the light. The heartbeat grew louder. It was not a single pulse anymore. It was a chorus of pulses overlapping and interweaving until they became a single vast rhythm that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. The floor vibrated. The metal instruments on the tray rattled. The glass window bowed inward. Liam realized with a sickening lurch that the cold in the room was intensifying. His breath was freezing into crystals that fell to the floor with tiny tinkling sounds. His fingers were going numb. The flashlight beam dimmed as the batteries froze. He was being frozen out, frozen in. The dead outside were not just watching, they were reaching through. He stumbled to the intercom on the wall and pressed the button. Static. The line was dead. He tried the phone on the desk. Dead. His cell phone had no signal. He was completely alone. The only other living soul in the building was Evelyn on the 2nd floor, and she might as well have been on the other side of the world. He was trapped in a box of cold and darkness with the dead pressing in from all sides. The heartbeat thundered through his chest, syncopating with his own racing pulse until he could no longer tell which rhythm was his. He did the only thing that made sense in that moment. He walked back to the body of Daniel Croft. The logger lay exactly where Liam had left him, still frozen solid, still shimmering with those crystalline patterns. Liam leaned down close to the frozen face. The man's eyes were closed. His expression was peaceful. But the crystals on his chest were glowing now, a soft blue luminescence that pulsed in time with the heartbeat from outside. Liam realized what he was looking at. The crystals were not a disease. They were not a natural phenomenon. They were a transmitter, a beacon. Something had colonized Daniel Croft's body while he lay dying in the snow, something ancient that lived in the deep cold, that slept beneath the permafrost of the northern wilderness. The spiral symbol was its mark, and the heartbeat was its call. The dead outside were answering. They were the others, the ones who had frozen in these woods over centuries. Trappers and loggers and indigenous hunters, people who had walked into the snow and never walked out. Their bodies were buried in the forest, scattered in unmarked graves under feet of ice, but they were not resting. They had been claimed by the same cold entity. Their flesh was frozen, but their spirits were trapped, bound to the pulse, waiting for a signal to rise. Daniel Croft was the signal. His body had been brought out of the wilderness and into a building full of warmth and living energy. The cold wanted in. It wanted to reclaim what had been taken. It wanted to spread. Liam remembered his grandmother's stories. The spiral was not just a ward, it was a gateway. The old people had known about the thing in the cold. They had made offerings to keep it satisfied. They had buried their dead with fire to prevent the cold from taking them. But those traditions had been lost. The modern world had forgotten, and now the cold was waking up. The window shattered. The reinforced glass exploded inward, spraying shards across the autopsy table. The cold that rushed through the opening was not air. It was something solid and alive. A presence that filled the room like black water. The heartbeat was deafening. Liam grabbed the edge of the table and held on. The cold presence swirled around him, touching his skin with figures of ice. It was looking for something, looking for the beacon, looking for Daniel Croft. The body on the table began to move, not twitching or convulsing, but rising. The frozen corpse sat up slowly, its joints cracking like splintering wood. Its eyes opened. They were solid white. No pupils, no iris, just blank frozen orbs that reflected the blue glow of the crystals. The mouth opened too. No sound came out, just a cloud of frozen vapor that smelled of pine and ancient earth. Liam knew he was going to die. The cold was too strong, the presence was too vast. But his grandmother had told him one more thing. The cold spirits could not take what was not given. They needed permission. They needed a door. Daniel Croft had given that permission in his final moments. He had been lost and desperate and freezing, and he had reached out for anything that would end the suffering. The cold had answered. It had filled him with its essence and turned him into a doorway. Now that doorway was open and the cold was pouring through, but Liam was not dead. He was not freezing. He was still alive and still warm and still capable of making a choice. He could close the door. He did not know how. There was no ritual he remembered, no prayer his grandmother had taught him, but he understood something fundamental about the cold. It was not evil. It was hungry, yes, and it was terrifying, but it was also lonely. The same loneliness that had driven the unclaimed echoes in Dundee and the crimson fluid in Gary. The cold was the ultimate unclaimed. It had been here since the Ice Age, watching life flicker and die, never able to touch it because life was too warm, too fast, too fleeting. Daniel Croft had bridged that gap. His dying body had finally cooled enough for the cold to reach inside. Liam spoke. He told the cold that it was seen. He acknowledged its existence. He told it about the spiral and his grandmother and the old people who had not forgotten. He said the names of the frozen dead that he knew, the loggers and trappers whose obituaries he had read. He thanked Daniel Croft for being the messenger. Then he asked the cold to leave. He did not demand. He asked with the same quiet respect he used when he spoke to the bodies in his care. The presence paused. The swirling cold stopped moving. The body of Daniel Croft sat motionless on the table, its white eyes fixed on Liam's face. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the crystals on the logger's chest began to dim. The blue glow faded. The heartbeat slowed. The cold presence withdrew from the room, pulling back through the shattered window like a tide going out. The wind outside resumed its howl. The fluorescent lights flickered and came back on, dim and buzzing. Daniel Croft's body lay back down on the table. His eyes were closed. His expression was peaceful again. The crystals were gone. Liam stood in the wreckage of his morgue with shattered glass at his feet and frost in his hair. The window was broken, the snow was blowing in, but he was alive. He wrapped Daniel Croft in a fresh shroud and closed the drawer. Then he called Evelyn on the intercom, which was working again, and told her there had been an accident. The storm had broken the window. She came down with blankets and hot coffee and a look on her face that said she knew something more had happened, but she was not going to ask. In the morning the roads opened. The body of Daniel Croft was transported south for burial. Liam attended the service. The logger had no family, but a few of his co-workers showed up. They stood in the frozen cemetery with their caps in their hands while the coffin was lowered into a grave that had been dug with jackhammers because the ground was too hard for shovels. Liam stayed until the last shovel of frozen dirt was thrown, then he drove back to Prince George and went to work. The window had been repaired. The morgue was warm again, but Liam never forgot what he had felt that night. The frozen pulse was still out there, deep in the wilderness, waiting, and somewhere beneath the snow, another spiral was forming. Another beacon was being built. The cold was patient. It had been waiting for eons. It could wait a little longer. You've walked through 3 of the coldest rooms on Earth, the Unclaimed Echo in Scotland, the Crimson Fluid in Indiana, the frozen pulse beneath the Canadian snow. Now the silence belongs to you. If one of these stories crawled under your skin, drop a comment and tell us which morgue door you would never open again. Your words feed the dark, and we read every single one. Make sure to smash that like button so the algorithm knows you crave true horror, and subscribe to Mr. Whisper Official with all notifications on. We post new nightmares. And you don't want to face the next one alone. Share this video with someone who thinks they're brave. Let's see how long they last. Until the lights flicker again. Stay close to the living and never ignore a heartbeat that shouldn't be there.